July 26, 1944. Normandy, France. 0547 hours. The hedgerow country of Normandy smelled like burned diesel and wet earth. Sergeant Lafayette G sat in the loader's position of his M4 Sherman tank, hands moving in a rhythm that looked wrong to everyone who watched, while other loaders grabbed the next shell with their right hand and rammed it home in one fluid motion. Poole did something that made the replacements smirk and the veterans shake their heads. He reached across his body with his left hand, pulled the round from the rack on his right side, transferred it to his right hand in mid-motion, and only then seated it into the breech. It looked backward. It looked slow. It looked like the kind of habit that would get a man killed when the shooting started. His crew called him War Daddy, though he was only 21 years old. His tank commander, Lieutenant James Flowers, had stopped trying to correct Poole's loading technique after the third week in France. Not because Flowers approved, he didn't, but because the numbers made argument impossible. Poole could sustain a rate of fire that matched or exceeded loaders who used the correct method. More importantly, he never fumbled, never dropped a shell, never wasted a second searching for the right ammunition type when the commander called for it. His backward reload had become muscle memory so deeply ingrained that his hands moved before his conscious mind registered the command. On this particular morning, in a field 3 kilometers south of the village of Le Désert, Poole's backward method would be tested against the finest armor the Third Reich could field, and in the 6 minutes that followed, his unorthodox technique would obliterate 4 Panzer tanks and rewrite the small unit tactics manual for every armored division in the European theater. But first, the fog had to lift, and the Panzers had to make their mistake. To understand why Poole's loading technique mattered, why those 6 minutes in a Norman field became legend among American tankers, one must first understand the catastrophic disadvantage that Sherman tank crews faced in the summer of 1944. The M4 Sherman was a mechanically reliable, easily produced medium tank that was outgunned, outarmored, and outranged by virtually every German tank it encountered. The standard Sherman mounted a 75mm gun that could penetrate roughly 3 inches of armor at 500 yards. The German Panther tank, which had become the backbone of German armored formations by mid-1944, featured frontal armor 4.5 inches thick, sloped at 55 degrees to increase effective thickness to nearly 6 inches. Simple geometry and metallurgy created a terrible equation. A Sherman could kill a Panther only by hitting it from the side or rear. A Panther could kill a Sherman from any angle at any range where the gunner could see the target. The German Tiger tank was even worse. 8 inches of frontal armor, an 88mm gun that could penetrate a Sherman's armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. American tankers in Normandy developed dark humor to cope with the mathematics of their situation. They called Shermans Ronsons after the cigarette lighter because they lit on fire so easily. They called them Tommy cookers. They calculated that it took an average of 5 Shermans to destroy 1 Panther, and 4 of those 5 Shermans would burn. The United States Army knew all of this. Reports from North Africa and Italy had documented the Sherman's deficiencies in exhaustive detail, but American industrial strategy prioritized quantity over quality, reliability over capability. The Sherman could be produced in vast numbers, could be shipped across the Atlantic efficiently, could be maintained by moderately trained mechanics using widely available parts. The German tanks were superior weapons, but mechanical nightmares that broke down constantly and required specialized components that German industry by 1944 could barely supply. The strategic calculus was brutal and clear. America would win the tank war by building Shermans faster than Germany could kill them. But strategic calculus meant nothing to the men inside those Shermans. They did not care that for every tank they lost, 3 more were already being loaded onto transport ships in Philadelphia. They cared that German tanks could kill them from distances where they could not effectively return fire. They cared that a single hit from an 88mm shell would turn their tank into a blast furnace, that they had perhaps 5 seconds to escape the inferno if they were lucky, that the smell of burned flesh and rubber would permeate their dreams for the rest of their lives if they survived. So they developed techniques, tactics, small innovations that gave them fractional advantages in the moments that mattered. And one of those innovations was happening inside Lafayette Poole's hands every time his tank went into combat. Poole had grown up in Odom, Texas, a town so small that its population in 1940 was listed as 356. He had worked in his father's garage, developing the mechanical intuition that made him valuable to the Army even before he understood why. When he enlisted in 1942, the recruiters took one look at his transcripts, mediocre grades, no college prospects, and one look at his hands, scarred, calloused, always moving, and sent him to armored training at Fort Knox. He tested poorly on the written examinations, but scored in the top percentile for mechanical aptitude in spatial reasoning. The Army made him a loader because loaders did not need to read maps or calculate firing solutions. They needed fast hands and the ability to perform under pressure. What the Army did not test for, could not test for, was the specific adaptation Poole had developed during his childhood. Poole was left-handed in a right-handed world. As a child, he had learned to function in spaces designed for right-handed people by developing ambidextrous techniques that looked awkward but functioned efficiently. In his father's garage, he had learned to hold a wrench in his left hand and a socket in his right, to thread bolts with either hand depending on the angle of approach, to switch tools between hands mid-task without thinking about it. When Poole entered the cramped interior of a Sherman tank for the first time, he encountered a space that was viciously, unforgivingly designed for right-handed loaders. The main gun breech opened to the right. The primary ammunition racks were positioned on the right side of the turret. The correct loading procedure assumed the loader would stand on the left side of the gun, reach across to the right with his right hand, grab the shell, and ram it home in one continuous motion. For a right-handed loader, this was efficient. For Poole, it was impossible. So he reversed the technique. He stood on the right side of the gun, pulled shells with his left hand, transferred them to his right for the final seating motion. It looked backward because it was backward, a mirror image of the standard procedure. But it worked. And in the chaos of combat, where working mattered infinitely more than looking correct, Poole's backward reload became an asset. The key was the transfer, that moment when the shell moved from his left hand to his right. Poole's body position allowed him to verify visually what type of round he was loading. High explosive for soft targets, armor piercing for tanks, white phosphorus for marking targets or creating smoke. In the split second of transfer, his eyes confirmed what his hands were doing. Other loaders, pulling rounds from racks they could not directly see, sometimes grabbed the wrong ammunition in the heat of combat. Poole never did. His backward method built verification into the motion itself. By July 1944, Poole's tank, nicknamed In the Mood after the Glenn Miller song, had been credited with 12 confirmed German tank kills. This was an extraordinary number. Most Sherman crews never destroyed a single enemy tank. Those that did rarely survived long enough to accumulate multiple kills. But Poole's crew had developed a tactical system that exploited the few advantages the Sherman possessed. Superior gun stabilization that allowed firing while moving, faster turret traverse, and, most critically, higher rate of sustained fire. A Panther tank could fire approximately 6 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. A well-trained Sherman crew could fire 12 to 15. If a Sherman could survive the first shot, if it could maneuver to a flanking position while under fire, If the loader could maintain maximum rate of fire while the tank was moving over rough terrain, and the commander was screaming target coordinates, and the gunner was traversing and elevating, and the driver was trying not to throw everyone against the turret walls, if all of that happened in perfect coordination, the Sherman had a chance. Poole made it possible. His hands, moving in their backward dance, kept the gun fed. And on the morning of July 26, 1944, those hands would perform a feat that even he would later describe as impossible. The fog lifted at 0612 hours. Poole's tank was positioned in a sunken lane behind a hedgerow, part of a 4-tank platoon providing overwatch for an infantry advance toward the village of Le Désert. The hedgerows of Normandy were not the decorative garden borders that the name suggested. They were ancient earthen walls, 8 to 12 feet high, topped with thick vegetation and root systems that had been growing for centuries. They turned every field into a fortress, every lane into a kill zone. American infantry called the hedgerow country the Green Hell and meant it literally. Lieutenant Flowers was scanning the opposite tree line through his periscope when he saw the movement. Later, in his after-action report, he would describe it as a wrong shadow, too straight, too metallic. He had been in France long enough to trust his subconscious before his conscious mind caught up. His voice came through the intercom, calm and cold. Gunner, traverse right. Tank, 800 yards. Panzer IV. Poole's hands were already moving. The commander had not yet specified ammunition type, but Poole knew. Tank at 800 yards meant armor-piercing. His left hand went to the rack, pulled the black-tipped round, transferred it to his right hand, seated it in the breech with a metallic clang that echoed through the turret. The breech closed automatically. The gunner, Corporal Willis Oler, was already on target. The tank fired. The shell left the barrel at 2,030 feet per second. Through the periscope, Flowers watched the Panzer IV shudder as the round punched through its thinner side armor. Smoke poured from the engine deck. 1 kill, standard engagement. But Flowers did not relax because his subconscious was screaming again. Panzer IVs did not operate alone. Not in July 1944. Not in Normandy. Traverse left, tank, Panther, 600 yards, moving. Poole had the next round ready before the turret completed its traverse. The backward reload compressed the time between shots to 4 seconds. 4 seconds from breech opening to breech closing to firing pin dropping. Most crews needed 6 to 8 seconds. In tank combat, 2 seconds was the difference between killing and burning. All are fired. The shell hit the Panther's frontal armor and ricocheted into the sky, leaving a bright scar on the steel, but penetrating nothing. The Panther's turret began to traverse toward them. Poole did not need the commander to tell him what to do next. His hands were already reaching for another armor-piercing round, his body already moving through the transfer, his eyes already verifying the black tip that meant tungsten core, that meant maybe, possibly a chance of penetrating if they got lucky, if the angle was right, if God was watching. But Flowers made a different decision. Driver, forward. Gunner, stay on target. The Sherman lurched out of the sunken lane and into the open field, accelerating toward the Panther. It was a suicidal maneuver by every doctrine in the training manual. Moving toward a Panther was how Sherman crews died. But Flowers understood something that the manuals did not. The Panther's 75mm gun was stabilized only in the vertical plane. If the Panther was moving, and it was, repositioning to engage what it thought was a stationary target, its gunner would need several seconds to acquire a stable firing solution once the Sherman appeared in an unexpected location. The Sherman had those seconds. Barely. Poole loaded. Oler fired while the tank was still accelerating. The shot went low, hit the Panther's lower glasses plate, and, miraculously, penetrated. The Panther stopped moving. Smoke, then fire. 2 kills. Traverse right, tank, Tiger, 900 yards, hull down. Poole's hands did not hesitate, though his mind screamed that this was wrong, this was impossible. You cannot fight a Tiger and a Sherman in an open field in daylight. This is how you die.
But his hands did not care about possibility. They reached and transferred and loaded, and the gun fired, and the shell bounced off the Tiger's frontal armor like a stone off a castle wall. The Tiger's 88mm gun was turning toward them with the inevitability of a clock hand. Poole could see it through the small vision port beside his station, could see the massive barrel elevating, could calculate without thinking that in approximately 3 seconds that barrel would fire and the shell would cover 900 yards in less than a second, and in the mood would cease to exist as anything recognizable as a tank. Flowers, driver, left, hard left, gunner, wait for flank. The Sherman turned so violently that Poole lost his footing and slammed against the ammunition rack. The Tiger fired. The 88mm shell passed through the space where the Sherman had been 1 second earlier and detonated against a hedgerow 200 yards behind them. Poole pulled himself up, grabbed the next round, his hands still moving in the backward pattern, even though he had just been thrown against a steel wall hard enough to crack ribs, and loaded. The Sherman's turn had brought it perpendicular to the Tiger's position. The Tiger's turret was still traversing to follow. For perhaps 2 seconds, the Tiger's side armor was exposed. 2 seconds was enough. Aller fired. The shell penetrated the Tiger's side armor just below the turret ring. Poole saw the ammunition cook off through his vision port, a gout of flame that blew the Tiger's turret 10 feet into the air. 3 kills. Traverse right, tank, another Panther, 700 yards, engaging us. Poole's conscious mind had stopped processing information. He was operating on pure training now, pure muscle memory, his hands moving through the backward reload while his eyes stayed fixed on the racks, and his ears filtered the commander's voice from the noise of the engine and the gunfire and the high-pitched ringing that meant his eardrums were damaged but still functional. Load, fire, breech open. Load, fire. The 4th Panther took 3 shots. The first missed. The second penetrated but failed to kill, some fluke of angle or internal configuration that left the Panther mobile and dangerous. The third shot, fired while In the Mood was reversing at full speed and Aller was compensating for motion and cant, and the gunner in the Panther was doing the same, hit the Panther's ammunition storage. The Panther exploded with enough force that Poole felt the concussion through the Sherman's armor. 4 kills, 6 minutes, 17 rounds expended, 0 casualties. When the shooting stopped and the ringing in Poole's ears faded enough to hear human voices again, he realized that Lieutenant Flowers was laughing. Not hysterical laughter, not relief, but the kind of laughter that emerges when a man survives something that should have killed him and cannot process the experience except through inappropriate emotion. "Poole," Flowers said through the intercom, his voice still shaking with laughter or adrenaline or both. "Poole, you beautiful backward bastard. I don't care how wrong it looks. Don't you ever change." Poole did not respond because his hands were shaking too hard to key the intercom. He sat down on the turret floor, still holding an armor-piercing round in his left hand, and waited for his body to remember how to stop preparing for death. The after-action report filed by Lieutenant Flowers was initially flagged as exaggerated. 4 German tanks destroyed in 6 minutes by a single Sherman was not merely unusual, it was statistically improbable to the point of impossibility. But other crews from the platoon confirmed the engagement. Intelligence officers examined the wrecks and verified the kills. Flowers' report was forwarded up the chain of command, where it eventually reached the desk of General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group. Bradley did not care about the tactics. He cared about the implications. If one Sherman crew could destroy 4 German tanks in a single engagement, the kill ratio mathematics that justified American tank production strategy suddenly looked more favorable. Bradley ordered a technical evaluation team to interview Poole's entire crew and document their procedures. The team spent 3 days at the unit. They filmed Poole's loading technique. They timed him. They compared his rate of fire to loaders using standard methods, and they discovered something that Poole himself had never articulated. His backward reload was not just different, it was better.
Not for everyone. Right-handed loaders could not replicate it without extensive retraining, and the Army was not going to retrain thousands of loaders based on one man's adaptation. But the evaluation team identified two elements of Poole's technique that could be universally applied. First, the visual verification built into the transfer motion. Training manuals were revised to emphasize that loaders should confirm ammunition type by sight, not just by rack position. Second, the ambidextrous approach to handling rounds. Poole could load effectively even when the tank was canted at extreme angles because he could use either hand as primary depending on body position. The revised training incorporated exercises designed to develop basic ambidextrous capability in all loaders. But the more important impact was psychological. Poole's crew proved that Sherman tanks could win engagements against superior German armor if the crew worked as a perfect unit and if the loader could sustain maximum rate of fire under conditions that would break most men. The story spread through the armored divisions. War Daddy Poole became a legend, his backward reload became a symbol, and Sherman crews who had been fighting with the fatalistic certainty that German tanks were invincible began to believe that maybe, possibly, they could survive. The symbolic object in Poole's story was not a weapon or a piece of food. It was the shell itself, the 75mm round that represented American industrial abundance. German tankers rationed their ammunition, knowing that shortages and supply disruptions meant every round mattered. Poole's crew fired 17 rounds in 6 minutes and knew that thousands more were stacked in supply depots across France. The backward reload was not just a loading technique. It was a manifestation of American material culture, the ability to expend resources at rates that German logistics could not match, the transformation of quantity into a qualitative advantage through sheer speed of employment. Lafayette Poole survived the war, though barely. On September 19, 1944, his tank was hit by German anti-tank fire near the German border. Poole lost a leg, but lived. He returned to Texas, married, raised children, and worked as a railroad conductor. He rarely spoke about his loading technique or the 6 minutes that made him famous. When asked by historians in the 1970s why he never corrected his backward method to match standard procedure, he said simply, "It worked. Why would I change something that worked?" He died in 1991, aged 68. His obituary in the Odom Edroy Times mentioned his military service, but did not mention the 4 Panzers. Small-town newspapers have limited space, and to the people who knew him, Poole was not War Daddy. He was the railroad man with a limp who coached Little League and attended Methodist services every Sunday. But in the archives of the Armor School at Fort Benning, Georgia, Poole's loading technique is still taught to new tank crews. Not as the preferred method, it is not, but as an example of adaptation, of finding solutions that work even when they violate doctrine. The film of Poole's hands moving through the backward reload, shot by the technical evaluation team in July 1944, runs in a continuous loop on a monitor in the Armor Museum. Thousands of soldiers have watched those hands move, have seen the left-to-right transfer, have heard the instructor explain that sometimes the right way to do something is the way that keeps you alive. There is a photograph of Poole taken 3 days after the engagement near Le Désert. He is sitting on the front slope of In the Mood, his loading jacket unbuttoned, a cigarette in his left hand. His face shows no emotion. He is not smiling, he is not posing, he is simply sitting, existing in the moment between actions. The photograph is remarkable only because of what it
does not show fear, pride, trauma, or relief. Poole looks like a mechanic taking a break between jobs, which, in a sense, he was. That photograph captures something essential about the American approach to the war in Europe. The United States did not win because American soldiers were braver or more ideologically committed than their enemies. They won because American soldiers were mechanics, were problem solvers, were men raised in a culture that valued practical results over theoretical purity. Poole's backward loader was a perfect metaphor for American military culture in 1944. It looked wrong, violated established doctrine, offended the sensibilities of people who valued form over function, and it worked. The Sherman tank was inferior to German armor in almost every measurable way, but American tank crews did not need superior tanks. They needed tanks that worked, ammunition that arrived on time, fuel that did not run out, and the freedom to innovate solutions to tactical problems without being punished for deviating from doctrine. Poole's crew had all of that. The German crews they fought did not. And in the mathematics of total war, reliability and abundance defeated technical superiority. The 6 minutes near Les Déserts were not the turning point of the war. They did not change strategic realities or alter the course of campaigns, but they changed the men who witnessed them. Sherman crews stopped seeing their tanks as death traps and started seeing them as tools that could be mastered. The psychological shift was subtle but real. Fear became calculation, fatalism became tactical aggression. And in the hands of a left-handed loader from a town of 356 people, a backward loader became the symbol of everything that made American armor effective despite its technical disadvantages. Not because it was elegant or doctrinally correct or intellectually satisfying, but because when the Panzers appeared through the morning fog and the Tiger's gun was turning and death was 3 seconds away, those backward hands kept moving, kept loading, kept feeding shells into a gun that should not have been able to win, but did anyway. That is the larger truth Poole's story teaches. Democracy and abundance do not guarantee victory, but they create conditions where a Texas mechanic can develop a loading technique
that violates every rule in the manual, where that technique can be recognized and studied instead of punished, where 17 shells can be expended in 6 minutes without concern for conservation, and where the practical solution, however awkward it looks, can defeat the theoretically superior enemy. Poole never claimed to be a hero. He claimed to be a loader who found a method that worked. But in the machinery of total war, in the grinding collision between industrial democracies and authoritarian militarism, that distinction disappeared. The method that worked was the method that won. And the backward reload, moving left to right when everyone said it should move right to left, became the motion that represented American armor in the summer of 1944. 17 shells, 6 minutes, 4 Panzers, one man's hands, moving in a rhythm that looked wrong and felt right and kept the gun firing when firing meant survival. The fog lifted, the Panzers burned, and War Daddy Poole, sitting on the hull of In the Mood with a cigarette in his left hand, did not smile for the camera because there was nothing to smile about. There was only the work, and the work, however backward it appeared, was enough.